We now move into some books for younger readers, the first set of which is a series of books based on the television series Wishbone. Wishbone was an American series on PBS in the mid to late 90s about a young dog named Wishbone and his family. And whatever was going on in the lives of his family and their friends always managed to mirror a piece of classic literature. So you would see the modern day storyline interspersed with the classic piece of literature in which Wishbone always played the hero, or at the very least, the sidekick. Based on that series, they wrote a variety of simplified versions of those classic tales for children. And of that series, I have Don Quixote, The Odyssey, Romeo and Juliet, Oliver Twist, Robin Hood, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Ivanhoe, Dog Overboard, an adaptation of Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson, Homer, Sweet Homer, another adaptation of The Odyssey, Dog Days of the West, inspired by stories by O. Henry, and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. They also started a series of mystery books a little bit later on, of which I have The Haunted Clubhouse, Riddle of the Wayward Books, and Tale of the Missing Mascot. I then have a series of comics that both my mother and I absolutely love, although she was responsible for collecting most of them. There are a variety of drugstore copies of Peanuts cartoons, such as You Can't Win Them All, Charlie Brown, Here Comes Charlie Brown, Arriva Charlie Brown, which is a set of Peanuts cartoons in Italian that my aunt found when she visited Italy, You're a Brave Man, Charlie Brown, The Gospel According to Peanuts, You're in Love, Charlie Brown, Nobody's Perfect, Charlie Brown, The Wonderful World of Peanuts, Good Grief, Charlie Brown, Here's to You, Charlie Brown, It's for You, Snoopy, You're a Winner, Charlie Brown, and Very Funny, Charlie Brown. Then there are 3 that I picked up myself in the later years, such as Dogs Are Worth It, It's a Dog's Life, Snoopy, and Peanuts 2000. Then also have a collection which is falling apart, but we love it to bits, of The Wizard of Id, which was a fantastic comic series, which I don't hear a lot about anymore. Is it still being published in the paper? Let me know. We then have a series of younger chapter books, so elementary level fiction, which begins with Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes by Eleanor Coer, Marco and the Tiger by John Foster, which is one of my mother's favorite books growing up, Wee Gillis by Munro Leaf, which is a sweet book about a boy whose parents come from 2 different parts of Scotland, one from the Highlands and one from the Lowlands, and he has to try to figure out where he wants to live. And by the way, Munro Leaf is the same man who wrote the story of Ferdinand the Bull. Sarah, Plain and Tall by Patricia McLaughlin, and then the Magic Tree House series by Mary Pope Osborne. These were a series of books about a brother and sister who, through virtue of books and a magic tree house, are able to travel back in time and visit various historical settings. There are so many books in that series, and I read many more than I own. But I own Polar Bears Past Bedtime, Viking Ships at Sunrise, Hour of the Olympics, Vacation Under the Volcano, Tonight on the Titanic, Buffalo Before Breakfast, Tigers at Twilight, Dingoes at Dinner Time, Civil War on Sunday, and Stage Fright on a Summer Night. They also started to publish research guides or nonfiction books to supplement the fiction books. So of that series, I have Knights and Castles, which goes along with The Night at Dawn, which was book number 2, I believe. Next, I have Portraits of Little Women by Mary Beth Pfeffer, which were bits of Little Women adapted for younger readers, and each focusing on a different one of the March sisters. So in that series, there is Meg's story, Joe's story, Beth's story, and Amy's story. Happily Ever After by Anna Quindlen and illustrated by James Stevenson is a great story about a young girl who enjoys reading about princesses and knights, but also enjoys playing baseball. And one day she is made a princess, and she has to learn to adapt to being a princess, and things are never quite the same. 2 books in my favorite series, the Mr. Putter and Tabby series by Cynthia Rylant. These are about an old man who adopts a cat, not a kitten, a cat, who he names Tabby, and their adventures together, occasionally with his neighbor and her dog Zeke. So of the series, I have Mr. Putter and Tabby Pick the Pears, and Mr. Putter and Tabby Row the Boat. I also loved the Nate the Great series, about Nate the Great, a young boy who is a detective in his neighborhood with his dog Sludge, and the various friends that help him along the way. So this is Nate the Great and the Monster Mess, and that series is by Marjorie Weinman Charmet. Girls to the Rescue, which I reviewed in my August wrap-up, is a series of short stories about girls taking control of their own fairy tales. I also have the Oxford Book of Fairy Tales from Scotland, retold by Barbara Kerr Wilson. I also have a book on Clan Gregor, as that is supposedly where my family comes from, as well as 2 books about Roy Macgregor, the most famous member of that clan. And finally, I have a large book of read-aloud Celtic myths and legends by Joan C. Vernero, who I took a creative writing class from. And I love Celtic myths, so of course I was thrilled to receive this book. Next, we enter my picture books. So these are picture books that I loved and saved from when I was a child. And we begin with Jesus' Christmas Party by Nicholas Allen, which is the story of Christmas, but told through the eyes of the irate innkeeper who keeps being woken up by all these people. Next, I have A Christmas for Bear by Bonnie Becker, which is part of the Bear and Mouse series, which is just adorable. Bear is usually quite grumpy, but Mouse is always very cheerful and full of good ideas, and Bear gets swept along in them and ultimately has to admit that, well, maybe Mouse was right after all. We then have MOUSETON, ABBEY, The Missing Diamond, which someone bought for me as almost a joke present, but it is quite cute. Across a Dark and Wild Sea, which is about St. Columba of Iona. Wonderful Earth by Nick Butterworth and Mick Inkpen, about all the wonderful things that the Earth has to offer. Cross Country Cat by Mary Calhoun, about a cat who is left behind by his family and then improvises cross-country skis to find his way back to them. Then have Franklin's Flying Bookshop by Jen Campbell, and its sequel, Franklin and Luna Go to the Moon. A House for Hermit Crab by Eric Carle, about a hermit crab trying to find the perfect shell, along with The Very Hungry Caterpillar, because you can't go wrong. King Bob's New Clothes by Dom DeLuise, who was a celebrated comedian and actor who wrote this retelling of the Emperor's New Clothes in his own distinct way. And you can hear his voice come through in every single page, and I just loved it. We then have 2 collections by Tommy DePaula, his collection of nursery rhymes by Mother Goose, and his book of Bible stories. Then have 3 Harry McClary books by Linley Dodd, which are Harry McClary from Donaldson's Dairy, Harry McClary's Bone, and Harry McClary Scattercat. The Happy Lion by Louise Fatio, which is about the lion who lives in the Paris Zoo, and how one day the gate is left open, so he decides to go and visit all of his friends in the city, and gets some very strange reactions. I then have 4 Basil Brush books by Peter Furman. Basil Brush is a beloved British children's character on television as well as in books. So I have Basil Brush at the Beach, Basil Brush and the Windmills, Two Tales of Basil Brush, which include Basil Brush Goes Boating and Basil Brush Goes Flying, and Basil Brush and a Dragon. Sweet Molly Malone by Mel Fisher and Dave Orchard. Corduroy by Don Freeman, about the teddy bear who goes looking through a shopping mall at night to try and find a new button for his overalls. Friends by Helma Heine, which is a sweet story about a pig, a mouse, and a rooster who just have a lovely day being friends together. James Herriot's Treasury for Children, which are taken from his autobiographies such as All Creatures Great and Small, and taken the tales that are most appropriate for children and bound them together. So we have lovely animal stories of his time as a vet in Yorkshire. I loved the Angelina Ballerina books as well, being a dancer. So I have Angelina and the Princess by Catherine Hollibird and Helen Craig. If any of you have watched The Vicar of Dibley, you'll know that this is one of Alice's favorite books, The Story of the Little Mole Who Knew It Was None of His Business by Wernerd Holdsworth. My Great Aunt Arizona by Gloria Houston is just wonderful, and it's the story of her great aunt Arizona and all of the wonderful things she was able to do growing up and then as a teacher and growing older. The Little Red Hen and the Passover Matzah by Leslie Kimmelman, which is the story of the Little Red Hen, but with a Passover twist. Floss by Kim Lewis, which is the story of a border collie. Just in Case You Ever Wonder by Max Lucado, which is the story of parents telling children, just in case you ever wonder, no matter what happens, I will always love you. The Barefoot Book of Princesses by Caitlin Matthews is a wonderful book full of stories from all different cultures about princesses who are not your typical princesses, at least most of them aren't. My particular favorite in this book was the story of Turandot, but there are also stories from Hungary, from Africa, from China, all over the world, and they are just wonderful. Mirette on the High Wire by Emily Arnold McCulley. It's about a young girl in Paris who wants to learn to walk the tightrope from Bellini. But Bellini has grown afraid to walk the tightrope, so she has to teach him to have courage again. Arrow to the Sun by Gerald McDermott is a Pueblo Indian tale that my dad picked up when he was on business in Colorado. We then have the Church Mice series by Graham Oakley, which is the story of Arthur, a mouse who lives in a church in Wortlethorpe, England, and he is very lonely. And he lives there with Samson the cat, who has listened to far too many sermons, and has thus taken a vow of brotherly love towards mice. And Arthur and the vicar work out that he can invite all sorts of other mice to the church so they can find a safe haven in return for doing chores around the church, and they get into all sorts of adventures. So that series includes The Church Mouse, The Church Mice Spread Their Wings, The Church Mice Adrift, The Church Mice at Bay, The Church Cat Abroad, The Church Mice in Action, The Church Mice and the Moon is my particular favorite, and Humphrey Hits the Jackpot. Coat of Many Colors by Dolly Parton is, I think, the lyrics to the song that she wrote about her growing up being very poor, but how this patchwork coat was her coat of many colors. And when she heard the story of Jacob and his coat of many colors, it made her feel that much more special. Cinderella Penguin, or The Little Glass Flipper by Janet Perlman, is a retelling of Cinderella with penguins, and it's just adorable. Mrs. Katz and Tush by Patricia Polacco is the story of a little black boy in New York who makes friends with Mrs. Katz, who is a Jewish immigrant in a neighboring apartment, through giving her one of his kittens, who they name Tush, and the friendship that is created between the two families, and it's just adorable. The Relatives Came by Cynthia Rylant is all about the craziness and the fun that happens when large groups of relatives come to stay. Next is a very interesting book because I can't tell you what the title is, but it's a trilingual Richard Scarry book with words in English, German, and Czech. And my aunt and uncle picked this up when they were living in Austria and went to visit the Czech Republic. So I loved looking through it when I was little, but I cannot pronounce half of it. Uncle Lester's Hat by Howie Schneider is a wonderful story about Uncle Lester's hat, which is blown off his head and is blown all over the world and has wonderful adventures before making its way back to him. Made that much better by the fact that I had an Uncle Lester. 6 by Seuss is a wonderful Dr. Seuss treasury, which includes And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street, The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins, Horton Hatches the Egg, Yertle the Turtle, my particular favorite, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and The Lorax. Sheep Take a Hike by Nancy Shaw, part of the Sheep in a Jeep series, which is just adorable and has wonderful wordplay. O'Sullivan's Stew by Hudson Talbot is a wonderful Irish fairy tale. The Velveteen Rabbit, or How Toys Become Real by Marjorie Williams. Fawn at Woodland Way by Catherine Widener Zonefield is a wonderful book put out by the Smithsonian, which very much looked like what I would see in my backyard often growing up. In addition, I also have Little Red Riding Hood, also in Czech, so I can't pronounce that or read it, but it's very cool to have. And finally, Bravo, Brava, A Night at the Opera by Anne Siberel is a picture book, but is non-fiction, teaching children about the opera. And I found this quite recently, and I just had to have it for future children one day. Then on the bottom shelves is one of my largest collections, which is my American Girl collection. I loved the American Girl dolls growing up and all of the books that they put out. So here are some that I have. I have not kept up with the newer dolls, but these are the ones that I loved growing up. First, there are the historical books themselves, which are here. Each followed a different girl throughout a year in her life, in a different historical time period, and a different place in the United States. So we begin with Kaya in 1764, who was a Native American on the in the Pacific Northwest. Felicity in Williamsburg, Virginia in 1774. Josefina in New Mexico in 1824. I also have the first book in Spanish. Kirsten, a Swedish immigrant who moves to the Minnesota Plains in 1854. Addie, who escapes slavery with her mother to live in Philadelphia in 1864. Samantha, a girl in Mount Bedford, New York in 1904. I have 2 of the Rebecca books, a young Jewish girl living in New York in 1914. Kit living in Ohio during the Great Depression in 1834. And Molly living in Illinois in 1944 during the Second World War. You can probably guess Molly was my favorite because we looked identical when we were little. They also put out a variety of short stories about each of the girls, which I have collected here. I won't show you each one because there are a lot. Some particular highlights for me towards the end of this shelf were Molly's Route 66 adventure, which takes place after her 6 books, which chronicles her and her family driving along Route 66, which used to be very popular, but isn't anymore. Route 66 is really dying now. But not only that, oh, it's my grandmother's handwriting. Not only that, it has lovely illustrations throughout. There are fold-out booklets and maps along the way to really educate you on what Route 66 was like everywhere that they went. My other favorite were the non-fiction books that they put out to go along with each girl. I didn't get to collect all of them, but I did get to collect some. So I have Kaya's World illustrating what Native American life really was like in 1764. Felicity's world, growing up in colonial America. Josefina's world, growing up in the American Southwest. Kirsten's world, about pioneer America. Kit's world, growing up in the Great Depression. And Molly's world, growing up in World War II America. They also put out a series of mysteries called the History Mysteries, which I will not pull out for each of you, but you can see the titles there. They were absolutely wonderful. My particular favorites were Under Copp's Hill, which I believe takes place in the Italian neighborhood in Boston. Yes, in the north end of Boston. And Betrayal at Cross Creek, which was about Scottish and Irish immigrants in the hills of North Carolina. Lastly, in the American Girl book range were the Amelia's Notebook series, which I also loved, which were the stories of Amelia as she goes through the middle grade, say 5th or 6th grade, and all of the trials and adventures that she goes through. They were very funny and really rather relatable and always very interesting. The first book was, of course, Amelia's Notebook, Amelia Hits the Road, Dr. Amelia's Boredom Survival Guide, Love Amelia, Love Nadia, which was epistolary with real letters you could pull out and read between Amelia and her best friend Nadia, The All-New Amelia, Oh Boy Amelia, which my aunt for some reason decided to write directly on the cover, Amelia's School Survival Guide, Amelia's Best Year Ever, and Madame Amelia Tells All, and these were all by Marissa Moss.